Hey guys, welcome. Tonight we're going to explore an uncomfortable time in history. We're heading back to medieval Europe, to a time when winter wasn't just cold, it was life or death. We'll look at how people stayed warm, how they ate, worked, prayed, and even how they faced illness, loss, and the long, dark months together. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel, and how many corners of the world these old winters still manage to reach. Imagine you're living in Europe sometime in the 1300s. You wake up before the sun, not because you want to, but because it's cold. Really cold. Your breath fogs the air above your face. The blanket's scratchy wool, stiff with frost around the edges. You pull on the same clothes you wore yesterday and the day before. There's no wardrobe, no fresh layers, just linen, wool, and the hope that the fire didn't die completely overnight. You step onto the wooden floor. It's damp. Outside, the fields are hard as stone. Smoke rises from a few chimneys in the village, curling into the pale grey sky. The livestock need feeding, water needs breaking through ice, and your stomach, empty. It's winter, and there's still months to go. For people in medieval Europe, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. No heating, no refrigeration, no antibiotics. Just the knowledge passed down from your parents and their parents on how to make it through, and still, many didn't. Historians estimate that some of the coldest winters in Europe happened during this time, thanks to a climate period now called the Little Ice Age. Crops failed more often, food was harder to store, and yet, people found ways to survive. They built their homes in specific ways, wore clothes in layers that trapped heat, stored food with methods we've almost forgotten, prayed, helped each other, and told stories through the long nights to keep the dark away. In this video, we'll explore how they did it, how people survived winter in medieval Europe, from homes and heating, to food and clothing, to how community, culture and belief played just as big a role as firewood and stew. So grab a blanket, settle in, and for the next hour, let's leave the modern world behind and step into a winter that was anything but quiet. If you're picturing a cozy, well-insulated home with thick carpets and a roaring fireplace, you're definitely not in the 1300s anymore. Most medieval homes were built from wood, stone or wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw and sticks. That might sound sturdy, but the insulation, practically non-existent. The cold crept in through cracks in the walls, gaps in the doors, and even between the floorboards, and once it was inside, it stayed. There was usually just one room for the whole family. A central fire pit or hearth burned in the middle, with the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. That's right, no chimney, at least not for most rural homes. You lived and breathed smoke all winter long. It warmed the space, but it also made your eyes sting and your lungs ache. The ceiling beams would turn black from soot. The smell of smoke clung to everything, your clothes, your bedding, even your skin. But it was better than freezing. Some families banked their fires at night, piling ash over the embers to keep them alive until morning. If the fire went out completely, you might borrow hot coals from a neighbour, carrying them home carefully in an iron pot. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about life. In wealthier homes, things were a little better. Manor houses and castles had stone walls, thicker wooden doors, and sometimes even tapestries to help trap warmth. But stone gets cold, fast, and those giant drafty halls, they were like sleeping in a cathedral in January. Even in noble homes, people huddled close to the hearth or retreated to solar rooms on upper floors that trapped a little more heat. Hot stones were sometimes wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. Dogs were welcome under the covers, and beds, stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers, sometimes shared by multiple people for warmth. There were no thermostats, no safety nets. If you didn't tend the fire, the cold would remind you. Some families even kept livestock indoors, especially in peasant homes with connected animal stalls, not just for convenience, but for body heat. A cow in the next room meant a few degrees warmer, and that mattered. Windows were covered in oiled parchment, wooden shutters, or thick cloth, anything to slow the wind. And the darkness? Once the sun went down, light came only from candles, rushlights, or the fire itself. Most evenings were spent near the hearth, eating, sewing, praying, or just waiting for sleep to come. Because when the fire burned low, the cold came creeping back in. In winter, your clothes weren't a fashion statement. They were your survival gear, and the further you were from wealth, the thinner the layers got. Most medieval Europeans wore clothing made from wool and linen, durable, natural, and hand-stitched. Wool was the workhorse, warm even when wet, breathable, and everywhere. But it was also itchy, especially for those who couldn't afford the finer weave. Beneath it, people wore linen underlayers, softer, closer to the skin, and easier to wash. That's right, you didn't wash your outer clothes often, but linen could be scrubbed, boiled, and beaten clean over and over. In winter, layering was everything. You'd stack tunics, cloaks, shawls, even multiple hoods. Gloves weren't common for the poor, so sleeves often extended past the hands. People tied bits of cloth around their legs, like early leg warmers. And feet, always a weak spot. Shoes were often thin leather, turned at the seams, with little insulation. Some stuffed straw inside. Others wrapped wool around their ankles and hoped for the best. For the wealthy, winter meant fur, lined cloaks, fox-trimmed hoods, even fur boots if you had the coin. But fur wasn't just warmth, it was status. The law even limited what kinds of fur certain classes could wear. Squirrel, fox, beaver, ermine, all had social meaning. Common folk made do with sheepskin, if they were lucky. And everything was patched, repaired, and handed down until it fell apart. Colour also mattered. Dyes were expensive, but darker. Deeper colours tended to show dirt less, and might absorb just a bit more sunlight. But practicality always won out. You didn't dress for appearance. You dressed to make it through another bitter morning, another frozen chore, another long, dark night. Even indoors, people stayed wrapped up. The fire might warm the front of you, but your back stayed cold. So you kept your cloak on, your hood up, and your hands busy, because movement kept the blood flowing. When the cold set in, it wasn't just your fingers that stiffened, it was your entire world, and the right clothing could mean the difference between frostbite and making it to spring. And winter, food wasn't just scarce, it was the centre of your daily anxiety. Because once the harvest was over, what you had was all you had. There were no grocery stores, no deliveries, no backup plan. Every family entered winter knowing, if we didn't preserve enough, we may not make it. So how did they do it? First, preservation. Grains like rye, barley, and oats were dried and stored in sacks or barrels, high off the ground to avoid moisture and rats. Vegetables like onions, garlic, turnips, cabbage, these were root cellar royalty. Cool, dark spaces underground kept them edible for weeks, sometimes months. Fruit, dried, stewed, or turned into jams if sugar was available, which for most people it wasn't. And meat, Salted, smoked, dried. Slaughter happened just before winter, not during. That's when animals were fattest, and there was cold weather to help preserve the cuts. Salt was expensive but essential. Entire slabs of meat were packed in barrels of salt, or hung above smoky fires to dry over days. Cheese and butter were made in summer and stored as best they could, but both spoiled fast. Milk, basically non-existent in winter, unless you had an indoor goat or cow producing. Water had to be collected, melted, or drawn from deep wells, then carefully stored. Contamination was common, and boiling was only sometimes practiced unless it was part of a stew. And speaking of stew, that was your daily meal if you were lucky. A pot hung over the hearth, simmering for hours, sometimes days, with whatever you had left. Root vegetables, grains, herbs, bits of dried meat. Some families made a pottage, a kind of porridge made from grains and water, thickened with anything from beans to acorns. Bread was a staple, but not the soft kind you're picturing. We're talking dense, dark loaves, often sour and sometimes rock hard. You'd soak it in broth or ale just to make it chewable. For the poorest, winter bread might be stretched with ground-up bark, straw or bean husks. Was it nutritious? Not really, but it filled the stomach, and hunger wasn't a nuisance. It was a daily part of life. Children grew up with less in the winter. Mothers ate last. Fathers rationed what little ale or beer was left because clean water was often dangerous. Food became ritual. What to eat, when to eat, how to stretch it. The winter months were a balancing act. One spoiled bag of grain, one frostbitten storage route, one rat infestation, and a family could go from cautious comfort to full-blown crisis. That's why the fire never stopped. Not just for heat, but for cooking, melting, boiling, and hope. In the dead of winter, a steaming bowl of stew could feel like a miracle. And when you took that first bite, you weren't just feeding your body, you were holding the line against the cold, against hunger, and against the season itself. We don't usually think about it, but in the dead of winter, something as simple as getting water was a serious challenge. Wells froze, streams slowed or iced over completely. So how did medieval people get their water in the cold? If you had a well, you were lucky, but not off the hook. You might have to chip through ice with an iron rod, then lower a bucket by rope, and pull it up with freezing hands. For those near streams or rivers, someone would walk down in the morning, smash through the ice and collect what they could. The colder it got, the more dangerous it became. Slippery paths, brittle wooden buckets, frozen fingers. And once you got it home, the water might freeze again if you didn't keep it near the fire. So many families kept smaller pots or skins indoors, refilling them as needed. As for cleanliness, let's just say expectations were different. Bathing in winter was rare, extremely rare. Not just because it was cold, but because heating water was labour-intensive, and there was a very real fear of falling ill after a bath. People believed that washing opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to cold and disease. So unless you were wealthy enough to afford a warm bathhouse or heated tub, you mostly stuck to wiping down with linen cloths, washing hands and face with lukewarm water, maybe rinsing feet if absolutely necessary. And that was it. Clothing wasn't washed often either, especially in winter. It was too hard to dry without freezing. Instead, underlayers were boiled, aired out, or dusted off with snow. For hair, a comb, maybe some ashes or scented herbs if you had them. Smell was just part of life. You didn't worry about looking clean, you worried about surviving. Illness still came, of course. Colds, fevers, infections. But in many communities, dirt was safer than water, especially stagnant water, which often carried disease. That's why beer, ale, or small ale, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was safer than untreated water. Even children drank it, because in the freezing dark of winter, your worst enemy wasn't always the cold. Sometimes it was the water itself. In summer, a medieval day started with sunrise, chores, fields, markets. But in winter, everything slowed down. The sun might rise after 8 a.m. and vanish by 4. That left just a few hours of useful daylight and a whole lot of darkness. So the daily rhythm of life changed. You'd still rise early, not because it was pleasant, but because the animals needed tending, fires needed stoking, and water needed collecting. Mornings were bitter, the kind where your breath fogged indoors and ice formed on the inside of windows. The first priority? Fuel the fire. Then, maybe a bit of food, leftover stew, coarse bread, something to warm the stomach. Work still had to be done. Even in winter, peasants needed to. Mend tools, spin wool, weave cloth feed animals, chop firewood, clear paths through snow, but all of it was done close to home. In the dark season, the world shrank to a few miles at most. And since you couldn't work the fields, families focused on indoor labour, spinning yarn, brewing ale, preserving food, repairing clothes, teaching children prayers. Most homes had very little light. You might have a few tallow candles or rushlights, smoky, dim and fast burning. So people made the most of the daylight they had. Evenings were quiet. Families would gather close to the fire. Someone might tell a story, say a prayer. In wealthier homes you might read, if you had books. In poorer ones you'd simply listen. Night fell early, and when it did, there wasn't much else to do. Some historians say people slept in 2 phases during winter. First sleep around dusk to midnight, woke up for an hour or 2, then second sleep until dawn. In that waking period they might pray, stoke the fire, whisper quietly, or just sit in silence. It was a rhythm shaped by the season. Winter wasn't a time of action, it was a time of endurance. A quiet test of patience, and every day you made it through was a small victory. Winter didn't mean rest. It meant a different kind of work, one that was slower, colder, and often more dangerous. Because even when the fields slept, people didn't. You still had mouths to feed, fires to keep burning, animals to tend. In fact, winter brought a new set of daily battles. Water froze, wood ran low, food spoiled. Every day someone had to go out, often before sunrise, and start chopping. Firewood was life. Without it, the hearth would die, and the trees weren't nearby. You'd walk a mile or more through snow, swinging an axe with frozen fingers, hoping the wood was dry enough to burn. You carried it back on your back or dragged it behind you, slipping the whole way. And then you did it again the next day. Animal care was non-stop. Cows still needed milking, chickens still needed feeding. If livestock were kept indoors, they added heat, but they also added mess, smells, noise, disease. If they were kept outside, you had to shovel paths, bring hay, break ice so they could drink. If you were lucky enough to live near a forest or lake, you might trap rabbits or birds, or fish through the ice. But most days, there wasn't time. Survival was the priority. Tools needed repairing, boots needed patching, roofs needed checking for leaks. Everything froze, everything cracked, and no matter how cold it was, someone still had to go outside. Children worked too, gathering kindling, carrying water, holding the lantern while an older sibling chopped wood in the dark. There was no weekend, no day off, and rest wasn't measured in hours. It was measured in whether or not the work got done, because the work wasn't optional. Without it, The fire would go out, the food would run dry, and the cold would win. In winter, survival wasn't just personal, it was communal, because if your neighbour froze, you might be next. In small villages, everyone knew each other. Who had enough food, who didn't, who had a newborn, who just lost someone. And while life was hard, people helped where they could. A family with more firewood might share some with the old widow next door. A hunter might bring back extra meat and offer it to the church or the poorest in town. It wasn't charity, it was mutual survival, because no one could predict how long the winter would last, or whether they'd be the ones in need tomorrow. Monasteries and churches sometimes gave out bread or warm ale during the coldest weeks. Not much, but enough to warm the hands, maybe the heart. Fires were shared too. If your hearth went out, you could ask for coals from a neighbour. And even in the most humble homes, there was always space to huddle together on the coldest nights. People gathered not just to survive the cold, but to push back against the isolation. Long nights were filled with storytelling, prayer, songs, gossip, or simply silence shared between tired people. For many, it was the only warmth left. You see, winter had a way of humbling everyone, rich or poor. Food ran out, fires failed, illness came without warning, so people leaned on each other, and not just out of kindness, but out of deep, ancient necessity. In the harshest months, community wasn't a luxury, it was survival strategy. When the sun disappeared early, and the cold pressed in from all sides, people turned to more than firewood for comfort. They turned to faith and fear. Medieval winters weren't just physically dark, they were spiritually intense. The nights were long, the silence was heavy, and without explanation for much of what happened, people filled in the gaps with stories, rituals, and belief. Religion played a huge role. Many peasants believed that suffering in winter was a test from God, a kind of holy endurance. Churches held special prayers during the coldest months. Saints were invoked to protect against frostbite, illness, or wolves. People might light candles for the Virgin Mary, or place charms at windows to ward off evil during the longest nights of the year. But beneath the official teachings of the church, older folk beliefs still lingered. In the woods, people whispered of spirits, the wild hunt, a ghostly procession that swept across the winter sky, dark figures that prowled the roads after sunset, beings that came to your door in disguise, begging for food or worse. Children were told not to wander at night, especially alone. People believed certain animals, like cats or crows, might carry dark omens. Some households scattered ashes at their doorstep to detect footprints in the night. Others hung sprigs of holly or rowan above doors to ward off bad spirits. And midwinter, that was when the veil between worlds felt thinnest. Dreams meant more. Death felt closer. Every creak of the wood, every howl of the wind might mean something. Was it a fox in the snow? Or something older, something watching, in a time before electric light and scientific explanation? Winter was mystical, and for those living in it, a little belief might have been the warmest thing they had. Not everyone made it through the winter, and everyone knew it. In medieval Europe, death was part of life, especially in the coldest months. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. A bad cut could fester into infection. A fever could take a child in the night with no warning at all. And there were no hospitals, no antibiotics, just prayers, herbal remedies, maybe a travelling healer, and sometimes just waiting. People slept close together not only for warmth, but because no one wanted to die alone. And if someone did pass, the others still had to go on. In winter, burials were difficult. The ground could be frozen solid. In some places, families had to wait, keeping the body wrapped and stored until the soil could be broken. Churches offered simple ceremonies. Bells might toll softly over the snow-covered village, and then life continued. There wasn't time for deep mourning. The animals still needed feeding. The fire still needed tending, and others were still at risk. People coped through faith and through rituals passed down through generations, lighting candles, saying prayers, telling stories about the dead to keep them close, and often in silence. Winter was already quiet, and grief just made it quieter. But there was also resilience. In a world where every winter could bring loss, people learned how to hold sadness alongside survival. Not because they were cold-hearted, but because they had to keep going, because spring still waited, and the fire still had to stay lit. And then, slowly, the light began to return. The days grew longer, the wind softened, and one morning you'd wake up to something small, but unmistakable. Birdsong. Spring had returned. In medieval Europe, this shift wasn't just a change in weather. It was a spiritual moment. It meant you'd made it. The fire had lasted. The food had stretched. The people you loved, or most of them, were still beside you. The snow melted slowly, revealing earth that had been hidden for months. Children played again. Animals stretched into the sunlight. And fields, once frozen and lifeless, became alive with purpose. Farmers began clearing debris, checking tools, prepping for planting. Women hung out clothes and bedding to air. The scent of fresh earth returned. Crossing churches, spring festivals, and Easter rituals mark the symbolic end of darkness. It wasn't just a season, it was a rebirth. People smiled more. Doors stayed open longer. Stories were shared about what had been lost and what had survived, and while the next winter would surely come. For now there was sunlight and hope and green, and that was enough. It's easy to forget how much comfort we live with now. Heat at the push of a button, food in every season, clean water, light, warm beds. But not long ago, winter meant survival. For medieval people, it was a test of endurance, not just for the body, but for the spirit. And yet, through firelight and faith, through layered clothes, shared food, and ancient stories, they made it. Not because life was easy, but because they adapted, they worked together, they held on to tradition and to each other. Maybe that's the real lesson. That warmth isn't just heat, it's connection, the quiet company of others, the rhythm of shared work, the comfort of old stories told by firelight, so as our own winter nights grow longer. Maybe we carry a little of their wisdom with us, and remember they faced the cold, and they endured, just as we do, one season at a time.